work, and I can give that right away, but I have to be asked, or I can attach conditions to this. And that's the general idea, of course, behind copyright law was at some, there's maybe two general ideas, but like the main thing, the economic rationale behind it, you have to give authors something which they can trade in. If text can easily copied with the printing press, or if nowadays like everything can be easily copied with the internet, which is basically one big copying machine, there needs to something, because you can copy it, so you can't just keep it physically to yourself, so there needs to be a right which enables you to trade based on that work and realize an income. And generally, like, the rationale behind that is that that people will only engage in the production of new creative works if they have this right, if they know they have an economic incentive created by this right. Copyright law protects authors. Performing artists are protected by so-called neighboring rights. That's a little bit maybe here less relevant in this context, but in music there is this thing, copyright really is only about the people who write the songs, which are usually not the people you see singing, and they are protected by something else, that's neighboring rights law. Copyright law has, and there's a fairly new thing in copyright laws. It's not so new anymore. It's basically of since around 2000, is that technical protection measures, usually known as DRM here, digital rights management, are also protected. So you have basically a double layer, sort of you have copyright. Because of copyright you can apply copy prevention mechanisms, and then like even the copy prevention mechanisms are again protected by copyright law, so it's even illegal just to remove the technical protection layer. So it generated quite a, or better to say, there's quite a tendency in the last years to make copying gets easier, and the reaction usually has been to make copyright law stronger, more protective, longer lasting. Then one interesting thing also to note is that there's basically two sets of rights protected by copyright. One are the so-called copyrights, so the right to copy, the economic right, which is the temporary, and that has two components. The one, the right to copy, to make temporary permanent reproductions of the work in any medium, modifications of a work, so that's the actual copying, and the broadcasting, publishing, distributing, renting, performing, showing, making available on-demand service, which is basically the making available right, the publishing right. So where you publicly perform something, like as in a radio or in a show or whatever. And then there is something called moral rights, which exists mainly in the European tradition, which is like also which comes from a tradition of thinking about that actually creating a work is something which is a deep or creates a deep relation between the author and the work. So like if some people say like, okay, authors put a little bit of their soul into each work they produce, which might in some cases be true and in some cases not, and that also needs protection, is the rationale behind the moral rights. And so the moral rights usually are not transferable. It's something like you can sell, or you can transfer, you can license your copyrights or the economic rights, but some parts of the moral rights, namely the right to protect yourself against modification or uses of the work which are detrimental to your honor or good reputation, is something you can't even give away. You're like protected by law, so you can't even say I don't care about my work. The law assumes that you care to a certain extent, and you can't give something away just like that. Then there is so the general picture is like basically everything you create is fairly intensively protected, at least legally. You can all of you are active on the internet, and you probably have your doubts in how far that actually like vibes with reality, because basically, like we all know, you put something on the internet, it gets copied anyway. That's the intention of it. So this idea that you have the exclusive right to protect yourself, or to be asked first for all copies that are made or all forms of distribution taking place might be like the legal situation, but the de facto technical situation is of course that you don't actually have this level of control implied by the law, and maybe you don't even want that. Also, to give the other side of the balance is there are a number of exceptions and limitations in copyright. In the US they are called fair use rights. In the European sense they are exceptions and limitations. And there's no real international standardization of these rights, but there are a couple of things where these exceptions or limitations say you don't have to ask permission to do certain things, and maybe the most important, you all know, is the right to make quotations. You can just like take a part of someone else's work in order to critique it, or in order to discuss it, or in order to underline a point of yourself. You can take an insubstantial part of someone else's work, clearly show that it's somebody else's work, so give proper attribution and use it, which is probably something which is, of course, basically blogging thrives on this in the end, and journalism to a certain extent in the wider range also. There is a number of other exceptions to copyright law. The other one, maybe not so important here, but in the discussions around music, very important, is the private copying exception. So you can make copies for your own private use. You buy a CD or you buy something in an online store, and you have the right to make private copies as backups, or in order to have that in your vacation home and in your real home or whatever. And there are a number of educational exceptions which basically say educational institutions have access to materials. Sometimes, or most countries, require them to pay a certain fee, but they don't have to ask permission first. They can go like, I can use this as part of, you can use books as part of literature classes, and you just have to make sure that people get paid a little, but you don't have to negotiate a license up front. And there's of course the reporting about public interest events. So this is something which in many cases, like while football rights to football games usually are licensed for enormous amounts of money, you also have like these possibilities of showing 30-second clips in the news reporting and don't having to pay for that because it's public interest events. And then one last one, the reuse of press materials by the press. So in order to enable like the press to control itself, there's also things that copyright shouldn't interfere with that. It is maybe interesting here to note that while all these rights exist, like copyright hasn't really been, for example, while it's assumed to be like the motivation for people to start producing in the news media, it is not necessarily the prime incentive or one of the major incentives why people will pay for information. You won't pay for like you will not like. You could imagine something like, you could imagine a newspaper which just copies like yesterday's other newspaper and comes out a day afterwards and will be cheaper than the other one. That's probably, you wouldn't buy that even if it's cheaper, because the point here is not so much like the access to the copy or the access to the information per se, but the access to exactly that information which you want as fast as possible, which is also probably something blogs are, or like publications generally are not read if they are reporting about current affairs, not because like they are the authorized place to read this stuff, but they are the first, or they are in terms of style the relevant ones, or they make the specific selection. So it might, in general, the discourse has always been like that copyright is actually that what motivates people to produce, because it forces other people to pay for that. But there's lots of other motivations where you can actually go into and say, which are not copyright related, to go and say like people will come to my place and pay for it or watch my ads in order to access stuff which are not because like it's the official place. And the other way around, even not so relevant maybe in the sector of blogging or journalism, but on the other side there's lots of scenarios where copyright sometimes even makes it almost impossible to provide services which are really interesting from a consumer perspective. If you look at things like